has to be interpreted in order to find the latent dream thoughts. You had to find its meaning. Now, dreams only semi have an author. Not surprisingly, you sleep through, the conscious self, sleeps through the whole damn thing. So it's not like you made the dream as a sort of play for your own entertainment. Once in a while you actually can remember doing that. Those are called supervening dreams. But most of the time you simply experience dreams, but don't experience creating them like an author. And yeah, dream interpretation seems to be a perfectly plausible form of hermeneutics. It seems to be something we interpret. Dworkin's example of this is a social practice, the social practice of courtesy. He says we're courteous to each other by observing certain social practices we each understand. There's a text because there's a practice, namely a practice that you have to follow and be understood as following in order to convey the respect, which is the point of the practice. So respect as the object of courtesy is a social practice. It doesn't have an author. It grows up like the common law. It accretes. It doesn't have an authorial intention behind how you interpret it. So we have a number of interpretive activities that are not authorial intent creations. My last example is American constitutional law, which I teach on more than one occasion. There are these conservatives in America who think we're recapturing what Thomas Jefferson thought. That's ridiculous. American constitutional law has very little to do with what Jefferson or Madison or Hamilton thought on a particular occasion. If we're doing interpretation in American constitutional law, it's not to capture authorial intention, it's to do something else. In any event, there seems to be lots of notions of interpretation that are not recapturing of intention, and we need something broader. Now here, I think the ambitious hermeneutics of the 19th century had the insight that if you leave authorial intention, what have you got? They reified meaning into being a kind of category of existence which was primitive. So that one of those hermeneutics, Charles Brentano, the Austrian psychologist who was one of Freud's teachers, used to revive the scholastics from the Middle Ages notion of intentionality. And he said the hermeneutic disciplines are the disciplines where the thing you're studying is itself directed upon an object. That's what he called intentional in the scholastic sense. But the object doesn't really exist. It has what he called intentional in existence. Now that's pretty mysterious stuff. What's right about it is to say we're not looking for authorial intention. What's wrong about it is to think that there's an independent category of existence that is primitive, what Jan Searle used to call primitive intentionality, that can be the basis for an autonomous science. If you want a good instance of how wrong that can be, just look at Freud's metapsychologies. He thought he could duplicate all of physics as if it could be psychology. Energy and so forth, the structural id, ego and so forth. It's an attempt to make a science out of a bunch of ghosts. Now, one of the things that I've done in the last 15 years is work on neuroscience. And one of the central questions of neuroscience is how the syntactic engine that is the brain, in terms of its two-value switching mechanisms for reversal of ionization potential, that's all we really got in here, how that actually can be an engine that produces semantic properties. That's a great question, but it clearly succeeds. In which event, intentionality is not a basic category of existence. It is not the kind of thing that you can found a science on. It itself is reducible to certain natural sciences. So it's not the Geisteswissenschaften answer that we want. There's a third kind of answer that I also reject. It's the answer that my old debating partner, Stanley Fish, chairman of the English department at Duke for many years, in a famous book called Is There a Text in This Class gives. It is, well, what you find has meaning is not the authorial intention. It's not up there in the heavens like the Geisteswissenschaften tradition. It's to be found in what he called interpretive communities. Communities found themselves by sharing conventions of interpretation. And if they regard it as meaningful, then it's meaningful. The conventionalist answer that Stanley Fish, in his early incarnation, used to defend. That has all the satisfactions that shallow conventionalist answers always have. Suppose you're trying to figure out whether someone is really dead, and you work through the fact that they're not breathing, you work that they've got a flat EEG scan on their brain, and you say, is he really dead? And some bright person says to you, oh, well, that's easy. A person is dead if and only if most morticians would proclaim him to be dead. That's not false, but it's not helpful. Because what you want to say is, yeah, but what's the mortician's criteria for whether someone is dead? Because what you're interested in is whether someone really is dead, whether there really is meaning, not whether most people think so. So the conventionalist answer is too shallow. So what I do in the article that's in the book that I assign, still in print, Oxford University Press, is this. It's like Fish's answer, but a bit different. I say, look, an activity is interpretive if three requirements are met. One, you have good reason. There's some value being served. That's the first requirement. Second, by treating some phenomenon in the world as a text, that is, as a meaningful phenomenon, something whose meaning is to guide your actions or your beliefs. And third, valid interpretations of that text is to give you new reasons for action or for belief. So, good reason to treat as meaningful something whose valid interpretations give you new reasons for action or new reasons for belief. Let me just unpack that notion, since I don't think it comes obviously, and let me do it slightly out of order. Take the second criterion first. What is it for people to treat something as meaningful? It is said that Lord Nelson advised his ship captains before Trafalgar to send those old British ship of the lines straight at the French battleships. He said, go straight at them. Well, that's pretty good advice about understanding anything. Just go straight at it. But that's not what interpretivists do when they treat a phenomenon as meaningful. They rather do a side dance, a two-step. They first find a relevant text, and then the second step is to interpret the text to find a meaning that is to guide their behavior or their beliefs. They don't just figure out what they should do, what they should believe. That's the one step, going straight at it. They do a two-step. You put between you and what you do or believe this notion of a text, and you say what I do or believe should be a function of a text that I first discover and then find the meaning of in two separate steps. I call that the syntax-semantics distinction, because in linguistics, the bearers of meaning, the things that can have meaning in a natural language, have to first obey the rules of English syntax. They have to have what logicians call the form of a WFF, WFF, well-formed formula in logic. Before you know anything about the meaning, the semantics of an expression, you have to know that it obeys the laws of English syntax, which themselves, as Chomsky showed, are kind of tricky. So there's a semantics distinction, semantics syntax. To hold something to be meaningful is to find it to be meaningful without knowing its meaning. To find it to be meaningful because it obeys certain rules, syntactical rules, that are not semantical rules, so you don't know what it means. So take two examples. Freud, when he's interpreting dreams, says, the manifest content of dreams, the remembered part, that's the text that dream interpretation is to interpret. But he says, you got a problem. If you ask people what they dreamt on different occasions, they have different remembrances. So he gives what Hart would call a rule of recognition. He says, you recognize as the text you are to interpret anything they remembered, including even contradictory things. Treat it all with equal dignity. That is all part of the manifest content of the dream about which we're going to seek meanings. So notice that it was remembered becomes the syntactical test for what's the text for dream interpretation. Notice Hart's view and Raz with regard to law is the same. Namely, there's a syntactic text, a legal syntax amongst the positivists for what law is. In Hart's case, it's a rule of recognition accepted by officials that recognizes as a secondary rule what the primary rules of obligation are. without telling you what those rules mean. It recognizes the rules as having the right form, the form of law, because they are the distillates of a rule of recognition that itself has authority. So there's a legal syntax. You first figure out what the standard is, and then we'll interpret it as a two-step dance. The syntax-semantic distinction in law. Even Ronnie Dworkin, who pretends to eschew this distinction, actually makes it again and again. So in Law's Empire, he talks about the pre-interpretive data that his interpretation will interpret. In his older work, he adopted John Rawls' distinction between the concept of law and conceptions of law. Conceptions are interpretations of a concept, but you individuate the concept differently than you find the conceptions, which are the meaning of that concept. Or the old distinction between the obvious law and the unobvious law, between rules and principles. In all of Dworkin's jurisprudence, there is this syntax-semantics distinction between you find the text and then you interpret it, two-step dance. So that's what's to find something meaningful. What is it to give new reasons for action or belief? Well, valid interpretations give new reasons for action or belief. Those are not the same things. Reasons for action are part of your practical rationality, as Aristotle said. Reasons for belief are part of your theoretical rationality. You can have, as I said from the example of Aquinas, two different kinds of authority, practical, theoretical. So that God can tell you what's good and make it good by telling you, or he can tell you what's good by giving you good advice of what's antecedently good before he told you it was good. Either of those gives God an authority that gives you a new reason for action or a new reason for belief. Notice on the second of those, when God advises you what's good, doesn't make it good, but tells you what's antecedently good, he's actually giving you a reason for belief about what are your antecedent reasons for action. And that's the most interesting idea of theoretical authority. The weatherman gives you reasons for belief about whether it's going to rain. God, at anything like him, would give you reasons for belief about the reasons for action that bind you as a moral person. Those would be moral experts. That's still reasons for belief. It's still theoretical authority. So, two kinds of reasons that valid interpretations are supposed to give you. Now, they're supposed to give you these reasons in what Hart and then eventually Raz came to call content-independent form. Content-independent reasons. What do they mean? They mean they give you a reason just because of the nature of what was done and not because of the content of it. So, suppose you have a very good friend who requests that you do something. That she requested, Hart and Raz would say, gives you a reason, not a conclusive reason, but gives you a reason to do the action requested. That's what friends do. The same for promises, they think. If you promise something, it gives you a reason to do the action promise independent of what it was you promised. Now, if the friend requests that you rob a bank or you promise to help them, those are overcomable reasons by the reasons against doing what was requested or what's promised. But the reason in favor of doing either of those things is, as Raz and Hart would say, content independent. Independent of what it is you requested or promised, you have a reason to do it because it was requested, because it was promised. Interpretations of texts are supposed to be like that. Independent of what it means, it gives you a reason simply because it passes the syntactic test for text individuation that made it a text. That's what it means to talk about giving new reasons. There's one last refinement, which is the trickiest, which is the reasons given have to be what I call intentionality dependent. You have to give content-independent reasons by virtue of the meaning of what was requested. It doesn't mean you have to know the meaning, it means the meaning has to be the thing that gives you the reason. So that to do what your friend requests, ultimately you have to do the second step of the dance. You have to find out what the request meant in order to find out what it is you should do that you have reason to do. The same about the moral expertise of someone who's really good at morality, like God. Namely, you have to figure out what God meant. In order to use that expertise, you have to have what's I call intentionally dependent reasons. So they're a reason by virtue of their source and not their content, and yet ultimately they give a reason by virtue of the content, whatever it turns out to be. And that's complicated, but nonetheless I think faithful to what it is interpretation is. Now the big question is the third aspect. When do we have reason to do this peculiar two-step dance? Why wouldn't you follow Lord Nelson and go right at the French battleships rather than going sideways and coming at them through a text, right? When do you have reason to do the two-step dance? There's no univocal answer to that. You have to answer that for each activity that pretends to be hermeneutic. Why did Freud separate the first 6 chapters of De Drummer Deutung from the last chapter, where he was interpreting in the first 6 and explaining in the last one? Because interpreting isn't to explain, its justification for psychoanalysts was clinical. Freud thought you would come to understand your dreams, understand yourself, and get over your neuroses by understanding the repressed wishes that caused the dream. That can be true or false. The only question is the claim of value. Why is it worth paying attention to dreams? Because you might learn about something about yourself, a therapeutic goal. If you treat them as meaningful, and try to find their meaning as giving you new reasons for belief about the kind of person that you are, or reasons for action that you discover that you think are true, then you've done something valuable. Now, Wittgenstein looked at that and said, you don't have to use dreams to do that. You could use clouds. Look at clouds the way that psychologists look at Rorschach blocks and ask yourself, if those clouds are treated as meaningful phenomenon, do they teach me something about myself? And Wittgenstein's answer was, yeah, they do. As much as dreams, you can learn about yourself if you free associate to clouds just as much, even though in no sense, of course, are you the author of the clouds. That seems to be true of a number of activities, and we want to ask about law. Namely, what's the value served by treating either law practice or interpretation as interpretive, because that's what justifies this peculiar two-step dance of the interpretivist. You find a text, and then find its meaning, and only then do you know what you have reasons to believe or reasons to do. Right? That's the notion of interpretation that I try to defend. As I say, eventually, that leaves us with 3 questions to ask about any putatively interpretive practice. If someone comes along and says jurisprudence is interpretive, 3 questions to ask. If they come along and tell you physics is interpretive, same 3 questions to ask. The first question is the question, what's the text? Since interpretation requires syntactic text individuation, the first fair question is to any supposed interpretivist, what's your text? The second question is, what are the criteria for validity of an interpretation of that text? Something that Heidegger, Habermas, Gadamer, and others are notoriously poor at. Spelling out, Ricoeur and others, spelling out the criteria for a valid interpretation. But it's a fair request. What's a valid interpretation of the text once you've individuated the text? And then the third question, I call the question of justification. What's the justification? What's the value served by engaging in this 2-step dance of finding a text and finding a valid interpretation in order to guide your behavior and belief? What particular value in literary criticism, in theology, in psychoanalysis, in law makes those validly interpreted practices? Okay, that's a little longer than I intended to start. So now let's go to the meat of the question. And now you get to talk. So, fourth on the outline is this question. I bounced over 2 objections that Joseph Raz used to raise to my theory. I'll mention them quickly in case they occur to you and you can join Raz in this. He said 2 things to me in Jerusalem. Tell me when I gave this paper. It was written originally in Hebrew, but I gave you the English version. What was this? One is, look, under your theory, anything can be a text, right? Wittgenstein and clouds. Anything can be a text. Second thing, under your theory, any text can mean anything. Using as an example, one of my students, who was Joe Groden on the California Supreme Court, who literally wrote an opinion that the word and, conjunction in English, actually meant or in a popular initiative defining the insanity defense. An opinion which I applauded, actually. I thought Joe was right. I don't disagree with those so much as I disagree with finding them absurd. You know the old saying about reductio ad absurdum, one man's reductio absurdum, another man's modus ponens. Yeah, anything can be a text. A text can mean anything if you're at the level of general hermeneutics. But we have local constraints on both text individuation and on text validity interpretations, that severely constrain, say, interpretations in law. It's not that anything goes. It's rather only certain things can be treated as a text because the value of so treating them limits it, and only certain interpretations will be valid interpretations in light of what we call a theory of interpretation of legal standards. So it's not to say in principle anything can't be a text and that a text can't mean anything, but in practice, given the local constraints on hermeneutic activities of particular disciplines, not true. Anyway, let me then ask you the fourth and fifth question. Start with the fourth one. Is the practice of law interpretive? If interpretation is an activity as I've described it, a usefully distinguished activity, I think. Here I'm a fan of interpretation. I'm not the critic as I am of the extreme interpretivists. Interpretation is a useful human activity. It is distinct from describing a phenomenon, from causally explaining it, from evaluating it. It is a distinct activity we sometimes have reason to do. We have reason in psychoanalysis for therapeutic reasons to understand our dreams. We have reasons in literary criticism, on certain views at least, like Matthew Arnold's, because we morally educate ourselves through great art, Matthew Arnold's theory of criticism. We have reasons to pay attention to the practices of courtesy, because it's good to pay respect to our fellow citizens. The value, Dworkin's right, there's a value there. It makes sense of why we're interpretivists about courtesy. What's the value that makes sense of us being interpretivists about law practice if we're lawyers? What do you think? Are we interpretivists? Do you regard part of your toolkit as lawyers as being interpretive? Don't speak all at once. Yeah, go ahead.
If you don't mind, I'm thinking, I recently was checking on the order of things of Foucault, and he says there's kind of a circularity in those questions, like every time we're formalizing knowledge and formalizing law, for instance, jurisprudence, we end up with the question of what's the meaning of that? Why we do that? In the moral sense, in the working sense.
Yep.
And the other way around is what I see you've been building in your argument. That is, why you're interpreting, what are the criteria? You get back to forms. So the circularity, as I remember in Foucault, he said there was an anthropological sleep. I don't know how to translate that in English, but he said, if you keep on asking to people who are working with forms, what's the meaning? And if you keep asking for people who are working with meaning, what's the form? It's never ending. It's just a circularity. That's how I see it. I don't know.
Yeah, Foucault would not be my favorite example of an interpretivist of the modest sort. He's not modest. But in any event, look, some circles are worse than others. Dogs chasing their tails, a bad circle.
Yes.
Reflective equilibrium between text individuation and meaning validity is not a bad circle. It may well be. Take the American Constitution. You know, we sell this product to our grade school children that, let's see, what did I hear in the 5th grade? Thomas Jefferson was sitting next to God when he wrote the Constitution, right? So it's a divinely inspired document. Well, that's pretty crazy. We all consented. No, we didn't. I wasn't there. I didn't consent. And although my ancestors left Scotland after Culloden because they couldn't stand the British, their consent doesn't bind me, so there's no consent. I don't consent by not leaving. It's all a bunch of fiction. So what's the authority of the Constitution, you might say? Well, you know, people accept it as valid in America. De Tocqueville said the damned Americans are peculiar people. They take basic social disputes and turn them into legal disputes. You know, but it kind of works. We argue in court rather than shooting each other. That's a pretty good thing. At least we did before Trump came along. So in any event, we've got a peaceful dispute resolution, but it only works if the Constitution's pretty good in content. If it were a terrible document, if it were a Nazi document, then the fact that it resolves peaceful disputes wouldn't be enough. So we have a kind of reflective equilibrium we need to reach about the authority of the American Constitution. What's the text that should be authoritative for our constitutional reasoning depends in part on what valid interpretations of that text give us reason to do. But as Jack Welch used to say, nothing wrong with big circles. Reflective equilibrium is a stable position. That's why it's called equilibrium. And you might find that this text individuated this way gives you good enough reasons for action that you can justify the two-step dance of interpretivism. So I don't mind big circles. Little circles, they're a problem. Foucault, of course, thinks the whole world is interpretive, so that's just not interesting for this enterprise, I think, whatever its truth might be. Yeah.
Mr. Moore, can you rephrase your question just so I know if I started from the right?
Well, the question, make it more specific. Brazil has codes, like the United States has codes. We have statutes. Is applying a statute in a case an interpretive exercise?
Well, I don't have an answer for that, but just thinking about it, I would say that people, I don't know if I read the working super right, so if I'm wrong, you can, give your point of view, and Professor Ronaldo also. But I would say that it's not only a matter of why would people treat it as interpretive, but you can regard it as you cannot avoid treating it as interpretive because of what you think law is. I mean, from your...
Could you imagine as a Brazilian lawyer showing up in court and making this argument? Your Honor, there are these statutes that seem to bear on the question, but statutes, text, schmext, who cares? Let me tell you what the right answer is here, morally speaking. That'd be a good way to go?
I don't think that for all law areas you could do that. I mean, if you go to the first instance court, you probably shouldn't do that. But I think that if you're talking about those areas of law that are specifically correlated to what law is, I think, yes, people would probably do that. If you go to, I don't know, the Supreme Court, I mean, when you see the arguments presented there, they're, I mean, kind of really...
Look, everybody understands Supreme Courts are halfway Tecate justice under the tree. So let's leave them out. Be really, really mundane. The example I used to use with my students in interpretation was this one. Actual case. So somebody is carrying eviscerated chickens. Those are killed chickens that have been processed, but not fully processed. They've been killed, scalded, defeathered, and eviscerated. They're carrying them in the back of their truck. In the United States, it's a federal system. To carry them interstate, you need a certificate of convenience and necessity issued by the Interstate Commerce Commission if it's a manufactured product of an agricultural commodity. Is an eviscerated chicken a manufactured product seems to dispose of the case. That looks like an interpretive question. Yes?
No, I mean, sometimes no, and maybe.
How would it not be? Tell me how it would not be.
I don't know, but I don't know if you have like a gray area of the law, like. I don't know if you have specific rules for that, but...
Look, I mean, this is a gray area. The opinion actually has pages.
Like,
of
does
what
it apply
you do
to gooses?
a chicken
I don't know.
before you put it onto that truck. And scalding and defeathering is just the start. So you do a lot of things, but you don't do everything. You don't cut it up, you don't package it in cellophane, you don't have it ready for market. So it's in the gray area of being a manufactured product, right?
Yes.
But Does that make it not an interpretive question? Because many people, from Freud to Hart, used to say, oh, look, if it's easy, if it's clearly a finished manufactured product, it doesn't require interpretation. What takes interpretation is when it's not easy, when you're in the gray areas, in the penumbra, as Hart used to say. Now we've got to do some interpretation. What do you think? Is that interpretation?
Yeah, I don't know how to answer, but I'm thinking.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because what you just did was divide up cases between, as Dworkin would say, easy cases and hard cases. And in the easy cases where you're applying the plain meaning of the statute, you might be tempted to say, oh, that's interpretation. But in the hard cases where you're in the penumbral area where at least the type meaning of the word manufactured does not dictate a result one way or the other, you might say, oh, well, now that's just deciding what ought to be rather than interpreting manufactured, right? But that's not, I think, the view of interpretivists, and here I think they're right. Ronnie Dworkin is here just a mirror image of Lon Fuller, who made this argument much before. Fuller was much insulted when Dworkin came back from Oxford with his D.Phil and had gotten a congratulatory first, which is really quite impressive, at Oxford, and thus was a famous law student at Harvard, but he would never take Lon Fuller's course in jurisprudence because he thought Fuller was too stupid. Fuller was much insulted by it, but nonetheless, they never cited each other. But nonetheless, Dworkin's argument is just Fuller's argument against Hart in the 50s, which is this one. If you're extending a practice from its obvious cases to its unobvious cases, you're doing one thing and not two things. You're extending by analogy from the obvious case to the unobvious case, but it's all interpretation, both the obvious case and the unobvious case. What you're not doing is two different things, interpreting in the obvious case and then making it up for yourself in the unobvious case. So the Fuller-Dworkin view that I would agree with as well is you're extending, it's all interpretation, however unobvious it might be. Now, of course, Dworkin, myself, and maybe two other people on the planet, actually think there's a right answer to the question, even in the least obvious case, whether that eviscerated chicken is or is not a manufactured product, in light of the deep values behind whether it should be so classified. I think Fuller might have been there too. In any event, there are some of us who think there's a right answer about that, but whether there is or isn't shouldn't determine whether you think of this as an interpretive enterprise. So if we're going to ask the question, ask it the way that I invited. Ask my three questions about statutory interpretation, as we call it, of application of statutes to particular cases. Is there a text? And the answer seems to be surely yes. That's what the code books have. In a natural language, they have a description of symbols that you cannot ignore as a lawyer arguing a case, because the judge to whom you are arguing cannot ignore them. You are both bound by those symbols in that code book. There is a text syntactically individuated. It's the well-formed formula of the law, whatever it means. Is there an authority of that text for lawyers and judges? Well, here you have to do some political theorizing. Why are statutes authoritative? Fuller asked this question long before Dworkin did, but Dworkin asked it too. Why are statutes authoritative? You'll probably give a three-pronged answer. In at least the American legal system, you talk about the Montesquieuian separation of powers being a good functional, good in the sense of efficient division of how good governments work. We need a law creating body, the legislature, a law executing body, the executive, and a law applying body, the judiciary. You'd be right or wrong about that, but that's the theory. It's efficient. The second is the political ideal of democracy. The majority has the right to rule within constitutional limits, in which event that the majority is represented in the legislature, they've spoken, so the text they have spoken has authority for those who would apply it, both citizens and judges. And the third set of values is that litany of values going under the name of the rule of law values. That law peacefully settles disputes, It gives notice of what that settlement's going to be, which is good because it protects both liberty, doesn't chill you by knowing you'll know the sanctions in advance, and it doesn't unfairly surprise you, so that the rule of law values also dictate that that text have authority for judges and citizens. Suppose that's roughly right. Then you have a text, and you have reason to treat it as a text in light of the political theory that makes democracy the rule of law and the separation of powers, three good things. What's the validity of the interpretation? Well, here we all make a good living, don't we? I used to teach judges in the 80s and 90s in America, particularly after the Bork hearings in 1987, when Robert Bork, the Yale law professor, was denied a seat on the U.S. Supreme Court because he had a really lousy theory of interpretation, at least according to Arlen Specter and other senators who cross-examined him. Anyway, a lot of us used to teach judges what to say when the Senate Judiciary Committee would ask you, what's your theory of interpretation? Validity has lots of things that you can talk about. There's the lip service of Anglo-American practice of always pretending that you're looking for authorial intention, legislative intent. As Holmes said long ago, legislative intent is the general label you put on whatever it is you want to do in interpretation. Because, of course, there is no single legislator, there is only legislatures made up of many people with divergent aims. And although there are models to try and combine them, none of them seem very successful. And in any event, as Holmes said, I don't care what they meant, I care what they said. So Holmes said, don't look to legislative intent. What else do you look to? Well, the meaning of the words isn't bad. They used a natural language, and absent artificial, statutory, stipulative definitions of new meanings, the meaning of the word, like intention has in ordinary speech, is a pretty good first start, so what it should mean in the law. But then away we go with, do you look to the pragmatics of legislative utterance, the context in which the legislature uttered its statute? Some people think yes, some people think no. Do you look at prior interpretations by other courts of equal dignity with your own? Everybody thinks somewhat yes, but hardly conclusively so, because your ultimate authority is the text, not what your fellow judges said about it on some other occasion. Do you look to what Aquinas called the spirit behind the letter, what Longfellow always used to call the purpose, what Ronnie Dworkin calls the principle behind the rule? Do you look to the value that makes the rule make sense in a reasonably just society? Aquinas, yes, and Augustine, no, and people divide on that one, too. My wife and I used to teach the circuit courts of appeals for the federal judiciary. I remember Frank Easterbrook, law professor at the University of Chicago. We have a litany of cases with really absurd results if you follow the letter rather than the spirit. People like Frank Easterbrook follow the letter, at least they say they do, when they're not on the bench. So there is disagreement about that, but most people are more Aquinian in their theories of validity. You look to the value behind the rule as well as the letter in which the rule is expressed in order to find what the meaning of the rule is. Do you look to the safety valve that people used to talk about? The valve that saves you from absurd results. Aquinas, yes. Other people sometimes, no. Do you look to the tiebreaker rules, like the rule of lenity in criminal law? If it's not clearly prohibited, then it's permitted, if it's otherwise equal in interpretation. Do you look to what the 16th century English judge Plowden said? Do you look to the hypothetical intentions, what the legislature who enacted the statute would have thought about had they thought about this case? A difficult factual question, but still sometimes a possible one. Theories of valid statutory interpretations are complicated business. As I say, some of us who taught jurisprudence in America in the 80s and 90s made it quite a good living in teaching judges what to say about that. Judges are often better at doing it than they are in describing what they're doing. I had a judge once who said, did you know that story about the dance of the millipede? I said, no, I never heard it. What is it? He says, the millipede was a really beautiful dancer with all those legs. Then some damn professor came along and gave him the algorithm by virtue of which the legs should move. And then the millipede could never dance a step thereafter. It could talk about it, just couldn't do it. Judges are often better at mixing these ingredients into their theory of valid interpretation than they are at stating them. But in America these days, it's de rigueur for judges to have a theory of interpretation. So it looks like we have a text for statutes. We have a reason to treat it as a text, in terms of the rule of law values, separation of powers, democracy. And we have criteria of validity, as disputed as those might be. So I would think the answer to insofar as law practice is statutory interpretation, it is legitimately an interpretive practice. It joins the other truly hermeneutic activities like dream interpretation, theology, literary criticism, as a truly distinctive, interestingly distinctive interpretive activity. So check mark for interpretivism, I think, on statutes. Bentham started his 1789 treatise, the first of his projected 10 volumes on the codification of the criminal law of England. He only did the first volume, Principles of Morals and Legislation. He starts it out this way. He says, we should codify the common law of England, because the common law is the theft of power by hands that durst not steal it openly. He saw something essential about the common law. Insofar as the law we apply is the law of precedent, of past decisions, and not the law of statutes, as it is in America still for much of contract law, property law, and the law of torts. Insofar as it's common law, is that an interpretive activity? What's the text? What would be the text where you don't have a statute that bears on the question, but all you have are prior case decisions? Is there a text that you have reason to treat as a text that gives you reasons for decision one way or the other? The three questions about interpretation. What do you think? Is Bentham right? Bentham said this is a facade. This is just the theft of power. This is just moral reasoning by people pretending that they're applying something. All they're doing is sitting up there and dispensing codi justice in the name of this thing called the common law. Therefore, we should codify. We should treat it, make it into a truly interpretive enterprise called statutory law, rather than common law. Was Bentham right? Is common law illusory as law, at least as an interpretive enterprise? Try this example. Larry Alexander and I, the theorist in America who's well known, were debating the value of precedent at one point. Larry has a number of kids, most of them are law professors themselves. The first kid was a guy that he let go to a rock concert in San Diego. It shows how old we both are. It was by the Sex Pistols, a punk rock group in the 70s. You probably never heard of it. Anyway, he let the kid go at age 14. His daughter, who's now a law professor at Vanderbilt, his daughter then became 14, and she wanted to go to a rock concert of the same sort in San Diego. And Larry had changed his mind. He said, I don't think that's a good idea. You're too young to go unescorted to an American rock concert. They're too damn violent. She said, yeah, but you let my brother go, and independent of the judgment of the correctness or not of letting him go and me go, you let him go. And unless you're willing to make a gender discrimination, because I'm a girl and he's a guy, that I don't get to go, you have a reason, not a conclusive reason, you have a reason to let me go, based on equality. Now, that's a pretty good argument by a 14-year-old about to become a law professor. Is it an interpretive argument? Was Larry Alexander's past decision as a parent a text, valid interpretations of which gave him a reason to let his daughter go?